opponent really doing very much against him in those elimination rounds. He won with Painter that weekend. He's here playing Naya Hexproof, a deck that Michael Jacob wrote about on the premium side of Star City Games. He's a very big fan of this strategy. You know MJ. He's got his thoughts, and he's very strong with them about how this deck should be built, and it's hard to argue with him. You've got here the 12 Hexproof creatures inflated, 4 Glade Cover Scout, 4 Basara Tower Archer, 4 Witch Stalkers. Then Greg's got 1 Voice of Resurgence, 2 Goreclan Rampagers, your enchantments in Ethereal Armor, Madcap Skills, and Unflinching Courage. A couple copies of Gift or Rezova in the main deck, and then you've got 4 Boros Charms, 2 Celestial Charms, 2 Chain of the Rocks, and a Johnny Caller of the Pride. The important thing here about this deck and why it can exist is because it got an additional Hexproof creature.
And Mana Confluence is a big deal for this deck as well. Whenever I watched Naya Hexproof play, previous to Journey into Nyx, it felt like it spent too many turns just turn 1 tap land, turn 2 tap land, turn 3, now I finally get something going. If there was any deck in Standard that was in the market for City of Brass, it's Naya Hexproof.
On Greg Bargo's side, he's an Esper deck, I believe. Actually, he's Blue-White Control. I take it back. It's just a Blue-White Control deck. I don't know if there's anything too crazy going on. I do see 2 copies of Banishing Light in this deck.
And a main deck copy of Deicide, presumably replacing the Revoke Existence that was there in many decks prior to that.
A Temple of Plenty here for Greg is going to start things off. For Bargo, he's going to play an Island, follow that up with a Temple of Deceit. Looks like that card's going to stay on top before passing the turn back. One thing you'll notice, he does not have white mana just yet, and there is a Celestial Flare in his hand. So Smith is going to put the top card to the bottom from Temple of Abandon and pass the turn back. Both players off to very slow starts here.
And there are some elements of Naya Hexproof that are very good against Blue-White Control, and there are other elements that are not very good. Greg is looking for mostly Witch Stalkers and Hexproof creatures that he can go beatdowns with, backed up by Boros Charms and such. Less so is he looking for the Unflinching Courage part of the deck.
Yeah, the thing that's difficult about Naya Hexproof is that you really don't get to control your draws. It's just, okay, this is what I have, and this is what I get to work with. Now, Scrylands certainly do help there in some regards, but for the most part, you're at the mercy of what comes off the top of your own deck, because here's a Dissolve to take care of the Witch Stalker. And in some matchups, it lines up great. Others, it doesn't. That's just how it goes. Little scry action from the Dissolve here. You see Bargo looking at a Banishing Light, a Revelation of Plains, and a Celestial Flare in his hand. He's going to leave that card on top. We'll see if it's one of his 4 mana spells here, as we do untap in just a moment. Take a draw. Let's see what he kept on top, shall we? It's another copy of Sphinx's Revelation. Not a bad card to keep up there.
Yeah, if nothing else, he can cycle it this turn. And if nothing's really happening, then in following turns, he can draw some lands and fire off a Rev.
Voice of Resurgence to draw here for Greg. Looks like he's going to deploy this, or at least attempt to. And it looks like it is good to go before passing the turn back. And as you mentioned, it will just be a cycling of the Revelation. So Bargo's going to gain a life and draw a card. Not the best use of Revelation, but given that he has another one, that's okay. Especially because he drew a land off of it.
He's got to find something to do also.
Yeah. And this is obviously in response to the Voice of Resurgence because he doesn't want the Elemental to trigger. So Smith is just going to play a Sacred Foundry tapped, kick it back over to Bargo, who drew another land. It's a Hallowed Fountain.
And Voice of Resurgence seemed like it was printed with trying to beat a card like Sphinx's Revelation in mind.
Yeah.
You can see Craig with just a handful of instants. Voice of Resurgence potentially very problematic for him.
Might be time for a Banishing Light here. And it looks like that's going to be the case. So Banishing Light's going to take care of that. One of the things you got to like about these Blue-White or Esper Revelation decks is how I like to generalize them is that, you know, that Oblivion Ring style effect, we've seen it be great with the Tension Sphere. Now they have an additional one, Banishing Light. How many is supposed to play? Well, that question's up for debate, but it's definitely just a really powerful thing to be doing.
Especially when so many decks are trying to beat you with Planeswalkers. That's many decks, that's their whole route is going to Domri, Xenagos, Chandra, Garrick, some package like that. Having additional Detention Spheres is very good there.
Hallowed Fountain going to come into play untapped. If you're Greg Smith, you probably got an idea what that means. It's either A, Elspeth, or B, Revelation number 2. We can see in Bargo's hand that Revelation number 2 is what he does have, along with a Azorius Charm and a Celestial Flare. The other thing, too, is it's an untapped white mana.
Celestial Flare is so good in this matchup.
Yeah. Not a card that you see main deck a lot of. I know some players like to play 1 in their main deck. I think Adrian plays 1 in his main deck or 1 throughout his 75. It's obviously fantastic in this matchup, though.
Yeah, I mean, look at Greg's hand. It's just all creature enchantments.
Yeah, he's got multiple copies of Madcap Skills. Unflinching Courage. Looks like he's going to suit up the old Witch Stalker now. Now, how hard is he going to move in? I think that's the big question here. Because, you know, again, Celestial Flare is a card it's not a main deck card. So it's very easy for him to run into this trap, which, you know, obviously works out pretty well for Bargo.
And especially when Greg's playing that land on tap, very loudly indicating Sphinx's Revelation, he's got to get the ball moving. I mean, Greg can't sit here all day.
Yeah.
So he might just play right into the Celestial Flare.
And here comes an attack for 6, and there is the Flare. You saw Smith could have moved in completely there. He could have played another Madcap Skills and just gone berserk that turn and hoped for the best. Opted not to, took a little bit of a slower approach, which might end up working out pretty well for him, as Bargo is going to draw another Hallowed Fountain. He's going to play this one on tap too, with the thought of, okay, I'd like to resolve Revelation this turn. Fortunately for him, it's going to be for another card, as here's a Mana Confluence off the top here for Smith. That's going to allow a Witch Stalker to come into play. We'll see if he wants to follow this up with anything. This is going to be a Revelation in response to Witch Stalker. So the Witch Stalker doesn't get a counter. Bargo's going to draw 4 cards, also going to gain 4 life. We'll see what he finds off of this Revelation, though. So at least 1 copy of Banishing Light.
I do not believe he found an answer to Witch Stalker in that hand, though. So we can play on for a little bit longer.
A little curious not to see Smith cast Madcap Skills that turn.
I think that he's trying to avoid playing into a Detention Sphere or Banishing Light kind of effect.
Okay.
Where he can at least play an enchantment, connect once, and then have it get destroyed.
Sure.
But if he just allows Craig to curve into his removal, that's just too efficient of a game plan.
Bargo tapping mana here. It looks like it's going to be for Jace, Architect of Thought. It looks like that's the best card he has in his hand, and that's what's going to happen here. So Jace is going to come into play. It's going to tick down to 2, so 3 cards coming. Let's see what they are for the blue-white control player. Supreme Verdict, Plains, and Island. Pretty easy spot if you're in Smith's position. Get the Verdict on its own. It's going to go to Bargo's hand. This is a Plains. That's a Supreme Verdict. The board is clear here. You see Smith just hasn't really been able to get any footing this game.
That's a pretty dangerous play there from Craig, as if Greg had a copy of Boros Charm right there, he would have been able to just effectively counter the Supreme Verdict and then go about his business.
And kill the Jace. Yep.
Yeah, I think that if I was in Craig's position, I would have just done something else that turn, untapped and played Supreme Verdict with Dissolve backup.
Sure.
To protect against Boros Charm.
Ends up working out pretty well for him. Still does have the Dissolve. You see his hand right now. He also has a copy of Banishing Light along with an Azorius Charm. Charm arguably at its worst in this matchup.
Yeah, but it's good against the opponent that has to cast his Gore Clan Rampagers, that's for sure.
Yeah. That's exactly what Smith had to do on the last turn. So Madcap Skills is the draw for him. And you can kind of see some of the problem with the Naya Hexproof deck. You know, this draw is good against certain opponents. The one that Greg Smith had this game. If he's playing an aggressive matchup, he would be destroying his opponent right now.
Yeah, Witch Stalker plus Unflinching Courage is game over for a lot of those decks.
But right now, against what he's up against, which is blue-white control, his draw has not materialized very well. You've got an Azorius Charm, which I mentioned is arguably at its worst in this matchup. Well, it's at its best right now, taking care of Rampager and Madcap Skills and denying Smith a draw. Elixir is going to allow all those cards to go back in Bargo's deck. He's going to gain 5 life. He's sitting at 26, which is obviously a very high life total, and has a Jace to even play around with. So if you're Craig Bargo, you are in the driver's seat right now. You're just looking for a way to get this game over with before you move on to the sideboarded ones.
Yeah, a wealth of options for him at this point. More sources of card advantage in place with Jace. 2 Revelations just shuffled back into his deck. He's firmly in control here.
Elixir of Immortality, a card that kind of comes and goes in these lists. You know that Adrian Sullivan's obviously a huge fan of that card. And whenever I think about blue-white control, I actually think about Adrian just because he's one of the biggest, proponents of that deck and choosing to play the deck instead of Esper. And he's obviously a big fan of just playing Elixir. Do you think Elixir's at a good spot right now in the format?
I am generally speaking not a big Elixir fan, but if nothing else, it's still fine against random beatdown decks too.
How do you feel about Revelation?
It's pretty powerful once you have 10 mana in play, roughly. It's pretty potent.
Gore Clan Rampager, the draw here for Smith. He knew that was coming because of the Azorius Charm. Not sure how much longer he wants to try to slog through this mess because he knows that there's a Revelation coming. You see Bargo does have a Dissolve in his hand if he wants to counter this, but he says, you know what, I'm just going to Revelate for 7 instead.
Big fan of this play. You draw 7 cards. 7 life's pretty good.
Yeah, it's not so bad. Not so bad. I don't know what it's going to take for Smith to get back into this one. It's the game just doesn't gut. It just didn't gut anywhere that he wanted it to go.
The door is shut.
Yeah. This is obviously where blue-white or any Revelation deck is at its best. And even though we don't think this deck is going to see a lot of play on this particular weekend, just because it's very difficult to line up the answers with the questions that people are presenting on week 1, it's certainly not impossible. I mean, Craig Bargo's 3-0 in the tournament. He's off to a beautiful start.
Yeah. And a lot of these cards just are pretty broad-based answers to a lot of different stuff. Additional copies of Banishing Light, to supplement your Detention Spheres. It's hard to go too wrong with that kind of card.
You see his other removal. He's got 2 copies of Celestial Flare, which is great in this matchup, obviously, and pretty good overall. I mean, there'll be situations where it's bad, but a lot of the times it's going to be at least okay. We've talked about how many copies of Last Breath you're supposed to play. Well, Bargo only has 1. Is that right for this particular weekend? Who knows? That might come back to hurt him, depending on what he plays against, or it could come back to actually help him, because it can be very good in a lot of matchups. So it's all about that questions versus answers.
If it's wrong, it's probably not by a lot. That's the thing.
2 mana going to get tapped here for Bargo.
I think those is just a Mutavault
beatdown. It looked like, it was a little attack there from the old Mutavault before passing the turn back with a whole bunch of mana open. Smith just drawing a bunch of auras at this point. Jason's going to turn over a couple of cards. There's an Elixir, an Island, and a Mutavault. See exactly how Greg wants to split this. He says you can have a Mutavault or you can have the Elixir and an Island. Since you're already pressuring me with 1 Mutavault, do you want the other one? The answer from Bargo is yes, I do. He can play that for his turn. He can fire Mutavault up here. We'll see what he wants to do. He just says, all right, let's do attack this way. He's going to use the right Mutavault here. That's the one he played. He wants to make sure that everything is appropriate. We understand the shortcutting here that's taking place, so nothing malicious there at all.
It's not even that significant. If Craig misses out on 2 points of damage here, it's not going to cause any real harm.
I'd like to believe that's the case.
The game is in a place where Smith can simply not recover.
Discarding a Plains is what's going to happen here for Craig Bargo. I'm going to pass the turn back as Smith is going to draw a card. It's a copy of Basara Tower Archer. That's the new hexproof creature from Journey into Nyx. It's got some relevant text on it. The hexproof part, the reach part, chances are it's going to come up more than we think.
Yes.
Like, I don't think it's a very relevant part of the card, but chances are that's going to come up more than you think it does against Mono Blue, for example, and actually be relevant on the card.
But this deck would just play a 2-mana, 2/1 hexproof creature, period. So
yes.
The reach is just a little extra bonus.
However, that card did get dissolved. And now Bargo is going to fire up those 2 Mutavaults. He's going to put Smith down to 10, I believe. Jason's going to tick up. There's the 3rd Mutavault. And it's not fast and it's not pretty, but they get the job done. See, Smith looks like he picked up another copy of Boros Charm here. He's just going to pass the turn back. A Syncope picked up here for Bargo. Bargo with a Temple of Enlightenment in his hand as well. He's going to fire up these Mutavaults. Put Smith down to 4. And this is a Hollow Fountain that's going to come into play on tap. Bargo's going to go down to 31. And Jace is going to tick up. Can comfortably pass the turn back. As Smith is going to untap. He's going to take a draw. And it's a Witch Stalker. This is a Syncopate. He says, I'll make you pay more than 3. And that will get the game. Craig Bargo does win game number 1 here over Greg Smith. Blue Eye Control up a game over Naya Hexproof. Not sure how much Blue Eye Control we're going to see this particular weekend, but it looks like, oddly enough, his deck is kind of tailored to be pretty good against Hexproof.
Yeah, 2-minute copies of Celestial Flare and the 5th and 6th Detention Spheres and 2 copies of Banishing Light. It's about as good of a setup as you can really ask for.
How about a sideboard? He's got anything else to bring in here?
He has a Ratchet Bomb, a Deicide, 2 Negates, 3 Gainsays, a Glare of Heresy, a Dispel, 2 Last Breaths, Pithy Needle, a Jace Memory Adept, a Fated Retribution, and a Blind Obedience. I suspect the Ratchet Bomb, the Deicide, the Negates, and the Fated Retribution are all live here.
Okay. Definitely, I mean, Azorius Charm is an easy cut. I'm not sure how many of those he has in his main deck. Okay, that's a very easy 3 to go. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe like Elixir comes out because there's really not that kind of matchup, and the gaining 5 life is pretty incidental. It doesn't really matter all that much.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what happens with this one Last Breath, because there is only 1 target in Greg's deck, which is a single copy of Voice of Resurgence, but it did show up in game 1.
And you don't know if there are more of those looming.
Yeah, it could easily be a 4 of. We've seen Naya Hexproof lists that play 4 copies of that card, so it's not unreasonable.
Heck, there could even be more in the sideboards. We take a look at that. You've got 4 Skylashers, 2 copy of Mizium Mortars, 2 Ajani's Presence, 2 Aegis of the Gods, a Fiend Slayer Paladin, 2 Wear Tear, and 2 copies of Skullcrack. Turns out there's only 1 Voice of Resurgence throughout this 75 here for Greg Smith, but again, as you mentioned, Craig Bargo doesn't know that, so we'll see what happens with the Last Breath in the main deck as well as the 2 in the sideboard. There's a chance that those could come in as well, even though they're not great, but Voice of Resurgence is actually pretty good against Bargo's deck. All that being said, as far as options are concerned, you kind of like Skylasher, it's fine. Mizium Mortars, obviously you hate. Ajani's Presence is okay. Aegis of the Gods is just another creature, but the fact that you get Hexproof doesn't matter very much. Fiend Slayer Paladin, Wear Tear, Skullcrack. Wear Tear is actually good here because there are 6 Attention Spheres effects in the deck. Again, you don't know if Smith knows that, but he's got to probably have an idea that there are, you know, a pretty high number now that he's seen 2 copies of Banishing Light and has to assume Detention Spheres hanging out.
For sure.
So, the thing here for Greg is that his sideboard just really isn't tailored to beating a Revelation deck, but you can make the argument that there isn't really a sideboard to do that for this deck.
The only thing that Greg can really do this is, to improve this matchup here is to try to normalize his deck a little bit, which I think is a totally reasonable game plan. The problem is that so many of his creature enchantments are just poor. I mean, you saw 4 copies of Infliction Courage, 2 copies of Gift of Orzhova, and 2 copies of Chain of the Rocks. Even if those cards land, they're pretty low impact. So I think that he wants to keep in, his powerful pump spells like Madcap Spills and Gorclan Rampagers, Selesnya Charm to a lesser extent, and just try to have more draws that involve creatures. Because that game, he just didn't have enough threats to slog through all the removal spells and the Supreme Verdicts that Craig was bringing to the table. He died with, 5 creature enchantments in his hand?
Something insane.
Something insane. He needs to de-emphasize that a little bit because that game plan is not very good against blue-white control, and just try to become a creature beatdown deck.
Yeah, I think, I'm with you. It's still going to be tough. I mean, there are a lot of cards that are really good. I mean, maybe the play here is to sideboard out some of those auras and just try to move forward that way. I'm not really sure what the best approach is in this particular situation.
I think Unflinching Courage and Gift of Orzhova just have to go.
Okay.
Even when they're going to lead to Greg getting blown out a good percentage of the time, and even when they connect, they're not even good. Gift of Orzhova is especially bad.
Yeah, that one's pretty bad. That was pretty bad. It makes sense why Greg would want to have those in his main deck for this particular weekend. Again, coming to this weekend, all the conversation has been pretty much everywhere about, hey, a lot of people are playing aggressive decks because of Mana Confluence. So you want to definitely be good against aggressive decks, and that's why he's got 4 Unflinching Courages, 2 Gift of Orzhovas, and just the deck choice in general.
Yes.
That's exactly why you see him playing this deck. And, chances are he probably played against an aggressive deck or 2 in those first 3 rounds, which is why he's 3-0. However, his matchup here is just pretty difficult, and you can see just from the construction of his deck, a card, for example, he could be playing Mending Touch.
Yes.
He'd be really good in this matchup. Really good against Verdict, and it's just a good card against these kind of decks. He could have more copies of Voice of Resurgence to be better against, a Revelation type strategy, but he's opting not to do that. You can definitely see just with his deck construction, he's trying to beat a certain type of deck in this particular weekend, and this just isn't it. Now, that being said, it's not that he can't win, it's just going to be very difficult, and as you mentioned, he just needs to normalize his deck to try to overcome this.
Now, even though the matchup isn't necessarily the best for Greg, his draws of threats backed up by Boros Charm can win the game just as easily as they can out of White Weenie / Boros decks against blue-white. He doesn't, even though he has a lot of creature enchantments, that doesn't necessarily mean that his matchup is bad. He just needs to draw a healthy saturation of creatures, the right creature enchantments, and then ideally a Boros Charm as well.
We'll see how things do break here as Bargo is finally done with his sideboarding. Linsky is happy with his configuration. Greg Smith has been good to go for some time now. But if you guys are just joining us, Cedric Phillips, Patrick Sullivan, Star City Games Open Series here in Cincinnati. We're in round 4 of 10, 467? Excuse me, 76.
Yes.
476 showed up this particular weekend. So a pretty healthy crowd. Not as big as normal. Kind of strange to say, especially after Journey Nick's coming out, but definitely a lot of big names in attendance. That's the one thing that stood out to me this weekend, is that as we make our way through Season 2 here, I'd say we're about halfway done with Season 2 with this tournament. You see the players who are chasing points now. Joe Lissette is the big story coming from California, and he's going to be staying on the East Coast, during the week and then be in Knoxville next weekend, which you and I will both be at, but we have players that are really starting to make the choice. For example, Chris Van Meter, there's a team steal taking place in Roanoke this weekend, and he said, I gotta make the drive to Cincinnati, gotta get those points.
Two tournaments are greater than one.
Yeah.
So as nice as it would have been just to stay home and just play in the team sealed classic, gotta go out and try to get those points.
Yeah, and BBD did accompany him on the trip. Good friends doing battle with Jun Monsters this weekend. BBD sitting at 3-0 right now. Van Meter 2-1, did lose his last match, but we have seen Chris bounce back before. So we'll see what happens this weekend as both players taking a look at their opening hand. Do want to thank over 8,000 viewers so far today as well. So thanks for hanging out with us as we do work our way through a brand new standard format. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
We've seen some pretty sweet stuff so far.
Mana Confluence in this deck seems like an enormous upgrade to me.
You see Smith is going to start off with just 2 Ravnica dual lands, however. He's off to a really slow start. Does he have a 3rd land? He does not. Wow. And his hand's not great either. He does have 2 copies of Witchstalker, and that card's pretty good in this matchup. But you see his hand, he's got a Ethereal Armor, a couple copies of Madcap Skills, a Boros Charm, 2 copies of Witchstalker. And I was afraid that was what was going to happen, is that even though he does have lands to draw, there are a decent amount of them that come into play tapped, and a Temple is exactly what happened.
And Craig Bargo with Celestial Flare in hand, so he's even got insurance against the first hexproof creature.
A wear and tear of the draw here for Greg Smith. And it looks like Bargo has a Syncopate in his hand as well, so it looks like he's good against both of the creatures here. Greg Smith doesn't have an option. He has to deploy a creature. This is a Syncopate to take care of it.
And this is pretty damning. I'm not saying that Greg has a lot in his sideboard to bring in. You mentioned, in fact, that he doesn't. But the fact that Unflinching Courage is still in his deck means that I think he's a pretty big dog in this matchup.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the point where you have to get pretty creative and bring in a card, I think, like Skylasher, which is, it's fine against this deck, but it's not anything great. You know,
Correct.
It's just like, I don't really have much of a choice, so I need a card like that. As Witchstalker number 2 is going to resolve right now. You see Bargo's going to play a copy of Temple of Lightning, do a little scry action here. That card's going to go to the bottom. Going to pass the turn back over to Smith, who will untap and take a draw. Mana Confluence going to come rolling off the top of his deck. How much is he going to move in at this point? We saw him be a little bit slower in the last game.
I would imagine that we're going to see one enchantment with the intent of leaving up Boros Charm. Allows him to advance his board, gives his insurance against Supreme Verdict. I think if you just load up Witchstalker altogether, you just lose to too many different cards. You lose to Celestial Flare for sure. Even Detention Sphere suddenly becomes very good against you.
And there is Flare yet again. A 2-up in Bargo's deck. Really, really helping him this particular matchup as he draws a copy of Sphinx's Revelation for the turn, plays the Mutavault. And this guy on the right, Mr. Craig Bargo, he is in the driver's seat right now as a Johnny Call of the Pride, the draw here for Greg Smith. And this will be a Revelation, and it's going to be for 4. Bargo going to go up to 24. Never been under any real pressure this game to have the right answers at the right time.
Yeah, you know, the Naya Hexproof deck is very fragile against specific classes of cards. And you see a Counterspell and a Celestial Flare in Bargo's graveyard, and you don't need a ton else other than that.
Bargo going to deploy one of his sideboarded Ratchet Bombs. He'll play a Temple of Deceit. Take a look at the top card here. That card's going to stay on top. Just pass the turn back over to Smith. Smith's going to draw a card for the turn. A little surprised not to see him deploy the Ajani, simply because you can play the Ajani and not have a target and be able to continuously tick it up. Not saying that's going to get the job done or anything, but
I think he didn't want to do it into the face of the Mutavault.
that's fair.
But
It's fair.
it's not the most relevant in either case because Greg's just so far away from doing anything of note.
Ratchet Bomb going to tick up. You see Bargo's going to play a land for his turn. Getting those Mutavaults at the ready again. He's going to attack here for 4. Smith's life total is going to begin to become under duress here. He's going to go down to 16.
And Bargo with so much action left over in his hand, too.
His hand's great. He's got lands to play. I think he's got another Revelation there. The world is his oyster right now. You see Smith is looking at a wear and tear. I mean, it looks like he kind of wants to cash in on the Ratchet Bomb, but not really. He draws another copy of Ethereal Armor. And again, this is kind of the problem with this deck. Again, if this is a different matchup where he plays the Witchstalker and just kind of loads that thing up, we're looking at a completely different result. But this is one of the decks that does a really nice job of keeping Naya Hexproof in check.
Yes. Just too many good answers to hexproof creatures.
Tough part, too, is that they can just load up and make their matchup as good as they want to.
Yep. And Bargo with extra left over in the sideboard. I mean, he has a Deicide and multiple negates if he wants to go down that road. I mean, he has all sorts of answers to that sort of strategy.
This will be a wear targeting the Ratchet Bomb here. And it looks like Bargo's just going to sacrifice that for value. Because why not?
Yeah.
Bargo going to take a draw here. Did leave the Last Breath in his deck. Going to fire up with the Mutavaults. Going to put Smith down to 12. Smith will take a draw here. He's just looking for a creature. A Temple of Plenty might get him a little bit closer. He's going to put that top card to the bottom before passing the turn back over to Bargo, who says, let's do this again. Put you down to 8. He drew a Supreme Verdict for the turn. We'll see if Smith can ever find a threat.
Well, that's only step 1 of many to getting back into this one.
This is true. This is true. I honestly feels like the best card he can find is actually just Glade Cover Scout because it's the cheapest.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like it's a Glade Cover Scout. It's a Temple. He's going to play a Johnny now.
And this is only to hope that Bargo turns, pivots, and starts attacking Ajani.
Yeah.
But
Try and divert his attention, but that's not going to work. Bargo says, I'm going upstairs yet again. He's got a Detention Sphere at the ready for the Ajani if he wants to cast it. He's going to just play Banishing Light instead. Get that off of the table. Save the Detention Sphere maybe for something better.
Bargo would have to discard a hand size if he didn't do that. So
Smith draws a Boros Charm, and he's going to pick up the rest of his cards. Craig Bargo is going to win this match over Greg Smith. 2-0 in pretty easy fashion. Blue-white control defeating Naya Hexproof. Not the first time, won't be the last time. Seems like a great matchup for them.
I know there's a lot of people out there that really enjoy it when they watch a Hexproof deck lose. So I hope that you were tuning in for that one, because that was just a lot